Our panel is going to be a little different of education stakeholders. We are going to have something closer to a conversation than to a series of presentations, although each person has developed talking points, and you'll see those in the handouts, and you'll hear that in the dialogue that's emerged. I'm going to make just a few framing remarks, introduce the panelists, and get out of the way. So first, many of you have participated in the edited report from 2 National Science Foundation workshops on data-intensive research in education. I just wanted to highlight for you that that is available for free on the internet. It's still pretty current, even though it came out last fall, and I hope that you will encourage people to read it because I think it provides a valuable foundation for a lot of the discussions that we're having. In the closing paragraphs of that report, I made kind of a bold analogy to big data in education being like the microscope and the telescope. Now, these are tools that allowed us to collect data that has always been there, but that was not accessible. It took a while to understand how to analyze that data, but when we did, it changed everything. And tacitly, what I was implying is that I think data-intensive research in education has that potential. Now, the analogy breaks down in several ways. First, to my knowledge, neither bacteria or stars have complained about privacy issues. So while our task is more complex than people who use these particular tools. But the microscope in particular, you know, the microbial theory of disease was one of the huge turning points in the history of mankind. And I think that we are similarly in a kind of dark ages in education where so many people are damaged by our educational system rather than empowered by it. And if we could, you know, develop data-intensive research in a way that it had a similar impact, it would be a big deal. So how might we estimate the benefit? I don't think we fully understand how to do that, and I'm going to walk you through a little thought experiment and how I've been trying to estimate the benefit, and I hope to get feedback on this eventually in terms of how I might think about it better. So who might benefit? By how much could they benefit? I'm suggesting a lot. And through what instructional strategies would this benefit occur? Because we have to know those 3 things, both to know what kind of privacy risks are involved and to know whether those risks are worthwhile. So a couple assumptions that I'm going to make in doing this estimate. One of them is that social justice is very important. That if we realize big data in a way that widens achievement gaps or leaves them untouched, we're better off spending our energies elsewhere. So big data should differentially benefit those who do least well in our current system. The second assumption I'm going to make is that this is not about intelligent tutoring systems or a lot of the other examples of big data that we've heard before, both because a lot of people have been working for decades and have probably realized most of the gains that can be made on relatively simple things to teach, and because if a machine can teach something, then a machine is going to be doing it in the workplace. And so while that's a way of dealing with foundational skills, it's a terrible place to stop. So what then are we looking at? We're looking at sophisticated cognitive, intrapersonal, and interpersonal skills that this far into the 21st century, people are now starting to call global competencies. And I don't have the time to go into what those are, but I think you know. So I and a number of colleagues at Harvard have been working to build middle school curricula that teach simultaneously cognitive, intrapersonal, and interpersonal skills that are global competencies. And we're certainly not unique in this respect. But we've learned a lot about the characteristics of data that are involved in this. So one of the things we use is virtual worlds, digital ecosystems that students explore in teams as ecosystem scientists immersed in those as avatars. So they're in a classroom in the middle of winter, but psychologically they're at a pond in the middle of the summer, and we're collecting the kind of log file data that comes out of virtual worlds, which is time-stamped, second-by-second records of actions that are sometimes quite difficult to interpret, but that potentially have a lot of benefit, because if you think about what an individual tutor is doing, an individual tutor is sitting there watching a student and collecting many of the same kinds of data. We also have things outside of the virtual world that similarly collect data, like a food web that traces the flow of energy through the system. And students develop concept maps, and we're in the process of making the concept map development also digital so that we can have both individual and team records of how they're thinking about causality evolved. And then, of course, we have video records of the kind of scientific presentations they make at the end. EcoMove is complemented by EcoMobile, where students go out into the real world with mobile devices and apply these scientific skills, not in a simulator, but in reality. We have students wearing GoPro cameras on their heads, and so we get to see what they're seeing, and we get to hear what they're talking about, and we can analyze those transcripts and try to look for evidence of learning. And so the point that I want to make is that today, with well-designed curricula that are open-ended and designed to teach sophisticated skills, we can get an enormous amount of information. We can get almost all of the information that a skilled person might get if they were sitting next to a student and watching just that student through an extended learning experience. So I think we have the tools. We have our microscope or our telescope. It's the analyzing the data. It's the making sense of what we're seeing now that's the huge problem. And we, as many others, are trying to make sense out of how we can interpret these rich data sources. But my instinct about this is that in a month, we can learn a lot about what students have or haven't gained in terms of science inquiry. In 6 months, we might be able to know a lot about where they stand in terms of the development of collaboration skills across a variety of venues, or leadership skills, or self-efficacy in different kinds of tasks, or what metacognitive strengths they have or don't have. So relatively sophisticated things that historically have been hard to measure, that still are hard to measure, but having all these different kinds of data sources makes that potentially easier. So what I'm implying here is a kind of a system that is not a tutor. It's a system that collects a lot of information about a student, weaves it together, and reports to students, to teachers, to parents, to informal educators, to anybody else that's influential in a student's life, and says, here's what I'm observing about leadership, collaboration, inquiry, knowledge of ecosystem science, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then those people are in turn, they've been given some advice, including targeted advice about what to do. They take it or they don't take it, but it's a kind of information that we lack right now, a kind of personalization that might be the frontier for closing the achievement gap. The other interesting thing about this vision is that I think it really changes the privacy equation, because now we're not talking about a bunch of data being collected, a bunch of educational processes taking place, and then a group of stakeholders on the outside, like parents, who are sort of watching things happen to kids that they may or may not understand or they may or may not approve of. We're talking about a system of education in which the data is shared because it's powerful, in which many kinds of stakeholders are informed if they want to be and can take action on the data. And so I think that's a different kind of way of thinking about privacy. So what I would urge is that we not fall into the most common error in learning technologies, which is the old wine and new bottles problem. We shouldn't think about, well, if we use a lot of technology to automate our current instructional processes, what are the privacy issues? We should think about, if we innovate what we're teaching, how we're teaching it, why we're teaching it, and who we're really trying to impact, what the ultimate goal is, what are the privacy issues? And I think this panel can do a great job of addressing that. So let me introduce our panelists. You have a detailed bio in your packets, so I will just be very brief. Bill Fitzgerald, who is the Master of Ceremonies for the panel, is a privacy advocate and technologist at Common Sense Media. At Common Sense, he directs the Privacy Evaluation Initiative, a program designed to evaluate privacy policies and practices of vendors building educational technology. Olga Garcia-Kaplan is a student privacy advocate who blogs her parent perspectives at the FERPA Sherpa website, advocating for responsible use of student data. She is also a member representative and parent liaison for the Special Education Advisory Council in her children's school district in New Jersey. Jim Siegl is a technical architect specializing in the evolution and design of enterprise-wide solutions that can scale to meet the needs of the 189,000 students and 23,000 faculty and staff at Fairfax County Public Schools. His current focus is in the areas of privacy, security, cloud computing, identity management, learning system interoperability, and mobile computing. And finally, Amelia Vance is Director of Education Data and Technology at the National Association of State Boards of Education. She focuses on education data privacy, writing NASB reports, working with other education and privacy organizations, and supporting state boards of education seeking to create or implement stronger state privacy policies. Bill, over to you.
Hey, thanks for having us here. It's great to be able to talk with everybody. And in this panel, we want to keep as much time as possible for kind of question answer from the audience, have just some general discussion. So, because there are a range of ways we can take this. Like, privacy is an enormous topic. I think any one of us on this panel could happily, and I mean very happily, talk all day about it. So we will. As much as that would give us joy, we will attempt not to share that joy with you here. So I want to kind of open up with just, again, a couple general observations, then we'll move on. But, you know, one of the things, in some ways, I think privacy is actually not the best frame for privacy. I think if we flip it and look at learner agency, we might have a more accurate frame. And I think if we often talk about research and privacy as a way of protecting observations of students. And I think if we flip it and, you know, what would happen if our research included observations from students, or if that was incorporated as part of our study by design? Like, and what if we looked at a research lens? You know, there's what we can learn, but there's also what we can empower. And if a question about research, and if a question, you know, which relates to privacy, is, you know, is there the potential that this work, or that my use of this data, or that my use of sharing this data could potentially deprive somebody of agency down the road? What's our obligation if the answer to that question is yes? So I'm gonna share a story that I've actually never shared publicly before, and given all the cameras, I'm going to fuzz it further in my mind to protect the innocent and the not so innocent. And this is from within the last 12 months. So I was reading a story online, as I'm prone to do, and it's about a research study. And there's a link to the results of the research study, and I follow the link. And when I get to the link, I see a map of a city, and there are a bunch of locations on the map. And when I click on those locations, I get application names. And then when I click on the application names, I actually go and I get the device ID and some other personal information about the human who was on the other side of that data. So I go back to the article and I read it again to make sure I'm not missing anything. Then there are a couple other links that I follow. I do a search on the research study, find the IRB for it, I go back to the article, look again at the data. I look at the reporter who wrote it up, and look at the researcher who did the work, and then I reach out to the reporter and I say, hey, I think you have just actually shared your information online in the story you wrote. And he emails me back and he's like, no, that's probably your information. And I'm like, no, I've actually never been to this city. I wasn't a part of the study. And then if you look at the URL, and then in the link, there's actually a URL that contains like an alphanumeric code, which is an authentication token tied to an individual. And then I did what any curious person would do, and I basically added one to it and got another set of data. And so I emailed the reporter back. It's like, nah, actually, I haven't been to this city in 10 years. It's like, I think that you actually live in this city, and this is your data. Could you take a look? Then I didn't ask, but it was clear that this person had actually been looking for a house because a lot of the apps were from a service called Redfin, which is a realtor. But I also knew where this person played with their kid because there were a bunch of things in a playground. I saw some other more personal information. And again, this is all from location. And the reporter was like, wow, thanks, and removed the link. And then I emailed the reporter back because none of this information, like all the URLs that were actually containing this information, were not encrypted. They were sent in plain text in the clear, which means that any participant in this study that has the app had been broadcasting their location, their device ID, the apps they're using on their phone, and a whole slew of other personally identifiable information from every single wireless access point they've been hitting over the 3 to 4 months that the study was active. This was actually a research study done at a large American university on privacy. So it had IRB approval. This privacy lapse didn't actually violate that IRB approval. There was no encryption in the app. They sent the authentication token in the clear. And this was all okay. And I reported this to the reporter. I strongly recommended that he pass it along to the researcher. I actually failed on my obligation there. I should have followed up with the researcher directly. I didn't do that. But this is a more extreme example of what I usually see, but this is not atypical from what I often see. So when we talk about kind of privacy and research and I think there are some advances that we can make, but we also need to make sure that we're hitting the basics. Like we actually need to start getting kind of a more solid understanding of information security and data handling, and just, again, knowing when to encrypt in transit, knowing when to encrypt at rest. And these aren't complicated things necessarily, but I think these are a small subset of the elements that I think we can filter back into our research practice to enable a higher level of trust. Like right now, like this story will pretty much never be known outside the room or to like the 20 people that watch this video. I hope it's more. And again, and I will never, if I ever meet the reporter face to face, he and I will talk and we'll laugh about it, but I hope. But that's about that. Like it's not going to go anywhere further. But these are the types of things that I've seen on a somewhat regular basis when even doing a superficial look at research. And I think the good news is that there's areas for improvement. The bad news is that there's areas for improvement. And when we talk about getting a higher degree of trust, I think highlighting some of these really easy wins can create a way that's beneficial for all of us. Okay.
Hi, good morning. So I had a slew of talking points prepared, and then I sat in this room yesterday and I heard all of you speak and talk about the research you're doing, and then my points change slightly, or the things that I want to highlight. But I am here as a parent. I have 3 children. 2 of them are in the public school system. The little one will be there next year. So I have a lot of stake into all this research that gets done. Furthermore, I'm a big advocate for kids with special needs. And when we talk about privacy and we talk about student data, as a parent, one of the things that is very important to me is how can I get information so that we can help kids? How can they help my kids? How can we help all these other kids that are going to be impacted by the studies that we're all making, that we're all contributing to. And one of the things, as we can all agree, big data can tell big stories, and those big stories matter. And they don't just matter to the research community, they matter to the kids that we ultimately want to benefit if we are going to give that information back to them. But what there is a lack of is getting that information back to what we have all called here in this room the human subjects, right? Or the administrative data that we get, and how are we looking at it. But when you flip it, as Bill said, from a student perspective, which is how we should be developing all our thinking, then who are we benefiting? Is it our own research that we want to make better? Or are we thinking, how can this help somebody? Or what is a student going to need from me? One of the things that I've learned working with students with learning differences is they are great at advocating for themselves, and we can't dismiss that. So in doing the research is, how can I benefit this kid, but what does this kid need from me? And in doing that research, that is a great way to look at it, because I think we can all benefit from it. Now, when we think about the privacy of that kid, now we're thinking in a different framework, as not just, I can't get the data, or I can't get access to this, or a parent has concerns about this and it's impeding my work. If you put it on a framework of the student and how we can benefit them, and you give that information to parents and make them understand the value of that, then we're talking in a completely different arena. And parents want that information, they want to know what's going on, but at the same time, they want to know that the information that they're providing about their children is being protected. So we all understand here what de-identified data means, but for a parent that is not as data literate as I am, because most of my work during the day and my paying job is about handling data and security and compliance and financial services. So I understand how all of this works. But a parent that has 2 jobs, that doesn't have time to sit there and look at a research study or look at an IRB guideline and feel comfortable with that, but they have a kid that can benefit tremendously from it, we have to communicate and we have to build that trust and not dismiss those concerns. So when you talk about administrative data, and you said, well, it doesn't matter, it's administrative data, it's collected by the school. To a parent, that is important data. It is important information that is there, and we can't just say it's administrative data. Because, for example, for a kid with an IEP, with an individualized education plan, there's health information, there's psychological information, there's behavioral information, there's learning styles. That is very important to somebody, and if a parent or a student is not comfortable in sharing that information, we have a problem, but there's a tremendous amount of gain to be made if you as researchers can get access to that information. So we don't want to stop you from that, but we want to make sure that you are getting the information and that you're going to protect it, and that my kid or anybody's kid is going to be protected in that sense. Because again, if you think about learner agency and students in that sense, at the end of the day, they should be the ones allowed to decide what that learning story is about them. And they need to get to decide how that data trail is going to follow them and what that says about them as they move in their educational history, as they move in their data history. How do they want to write that story about them? And that's why it's important to protect their privacy. And that's why it's important to get the information, have it there, allow them to decide what is going to be disclosed about them and what is not, but at the same time allowing you to do that research that is going to benefit them, especially in communities of underserved kids, underfunded schools, schools that really need that help and that information to help kids learn better. It's important, but you don't want to have such mistrust in those communities that they're going to shut you down. I know that, I have jokingly talk about, we can't stop talking about in Bloom, right? And we're going to high five about that. We can't stop talking about it, but it's true, and it is reality, right? Parental concerns, whether right or wrong, shut down a very important database that was being built for kids. So whether they were right or not, a parental concern group can shut down big research that could benefit other groups. So that is where we need to build trust and partner with schools, partner with parents, not necessarily just give us that in-depth, detailed research, but say, you know, I don't want to know as detailed as you're writing it, but I do want to know a high-level understanding of what you're going to do with this information and how it's going to benefit, maybe not necessarily my kid, but kids down the road, or how it's going to affect policy that can help kids down the road.
So, like Olga, I had a number of talking points, which I'll get to, but as I came here, one of the things that kind of crystallized some of the tension between balancing research and student privacy was walking into this room and seeing the poster board terms of service that said that you consent to data collection and unlimited reuse by virtue of participating in a discourse. And I think that is one of the things that is the challenge in having a conversation around research and data collection in public education, which is compulsory. So that's kind of one of my big takeaways. And in the efforts of modeling good behavior, since we are being filmed, I'll say that I am here today as an individual. I am not speaking for the Fairfax County Public Schools. These are my opinions. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are working in schools and some areas that I think are worth exploring. With regard to this area, policies and procedures regarding research data collection, I think, is one thing that schools tend to be doing better at than some of the other areas. For those of you that are familiar with the Fordham study from a number of years ago about contracts and school officials, regardless of the amount of data that was collected there, it did start a good conversation around that type of information, and schools needed to do a better job around managing the contracting and the transparency around how they were using school officials. Most school districts have pretty solid school board policies around how they collect research. Many school districts have formal policies and established procedures around internal IRBs. I think comparing that to some of the other ways that schools use information, I think that's one strength. I think areas where schools need to do more or to probe at some deeper questions, I think awareness. Many of my colleagues are somewhat familiar with FERPA. I think they may be familiar with COPPA, but probably misunderstand it. And I think that I would be stunned if more than 10% of my colleagues had ever heard of PPRA. It's simply not well known in K-12.
Define those.
Sorry.
Yeah.
FERPA or COPPA? Or,
COPPA and PPRA. Yeah.
So the Child Online Privacy Protection Act and the Pupil Privacy Rights Act, certainly things that relate to the use of and collection of data in schools. PPRA is certainly one that definitely has an impact on any data collection that basically deals with the sensitive 8 subjects and controls requirements around getting opt-in parental permission or opt-out parental permission, depending on who's funding the survey, and providing parents' rights for being able to inspect the survey instrument. So really this goes back to, I think we're pretty familiar with FERPA in terms of notice and choice. PPRA around survey collection also deals with notice and choice for parents and transparency. The 8 questions basically deal with income, religion, sexuality, and political beliefs. And that's just at the federal level. I'm sure Amelia will talk about how similar laws have been expanded to include prohibition of data collection, for example, in terms of things like gun ownership. So I think awareness is certainly one area. One that I do want to touch on in terms of transparency and norms, where I think we could do more, and the analogy would be where schools have made some strides in terms of publishing the list of vendors that they have contracted with under the school official exception. I think there are relatively few schools that have been as transparent with the research studies that they're doing and the data collection activities. They may have formal processes for IRBs, but I think more efforts could be done in terms of transparency in the same way that we're starting to get more transparent around the vendors that we contract with. And lastly, I want to touch on expectations. I think most folks in education are relatively familiar with what the paper calls administrative data. I think that there is less understanding around the nature of what the paper calls learner process data and what all that involves. And I don't think that the average teacher or the average parent would really be familiar with what all that entails. And I think in terms of the discussion that needs to happen, having transparency and clarity around what I would call the collection, the use, the protection, and the sharing of that data. So think CUPS, collection, use, protection, and sharing. And I think those are the areas that we really need to understand. And a number of the other talking points I think that we'll get to in the questions.
Can you discuss your 3 levels of risk? Or I can talk about it.
Why don't you talk about that now?
I'm going to inevitably mess it up. So I was just asking Jim, he has this wonderful framework that I have been attributing to you, but repeating everywhere about the 3 levels of risk when it comes to education privacy that I think is a good framework for what I'm about to talk about and really what our whole panel is about. So there's the risk of actually breaking the law, whether that harms privacy or security or not, just breaking a law. The second level is actually violating privacy and security, as was done in the study that Bill mentioned, but not breaking a law. And then the third level is perception. So again, really things that are not against the law that some people would not consider a privacy or security violation, but that show up on the front page of the newspaper and freak out a whole lot of people. And I really think, obviously these categories sort of go over each other. You can have a privacy and security issue that's also against the law, or a perception issue that's just a privacy and security issue and not against the law. But it's a really good framework, because when you're looking at your research studies and thinking about privacy as you're putting together research proposals and doing your work, which is hopefully built into your whole work and not just an afterthought, it's really important that you think of all 3 levels. This is not about compliance with the law. As we talked about quite a bit yesterday, transparency and trust are absolutely key here. And when you don't have transparency and trust, I am about to tell you what happens. So thank you to the Data Quality Campaign, who helped me pull together some of this data. And if you have not been on their website and want to have here's what student data is, here is how it's used in very simple, understandable language, they've done the work. Check it out, it's fantastic. In 2014, 7 laws passed in 7 states, which included at least one provision targeted at researchers. In 2015, 53 bills out of 187 in 21 states, and 6 laws passed in 5 states included at least one provision aimed at researchers. And then in 2016, 47 bills in 19 states, and 4 laws passed in 4 states, plus an additional 2 bills that were carried over from 2015 also passed, included at least one provision targeted at researchers. There is a severe lack of trust, and in total 19 states since 2014, just in the past 2 years, have passed laws that included at least one provision aimed at researchers. Frequently, these provisions take the form of
requiring some level of governance. I know Jim mentioned that most districts have on file some sort of way to deal with research requests. I do not share your optimism, since I know there are still quite a few state agencies that do not have a process formally in place. But there was a severe lack of governance from everyone and transparency from everyone really prior to the past 3 years. We had some laws in some states, but most laws had something saying, we follow FERPA, and that was it, let alone the districts, which also hopefully somewhere said, we follow FERPA. And this count that I gave you, the 19 states that have passed laws, does not include the federal bills, which have targeted researchers. And there's 4 major ones that were really reported. There was the one that is likely to pass in some form in the next 2 years, which is the rewrite of FERPA from Representatives Rokita Fudge, Klein, and Scott, who, if you don't know, they are the chairman and leading members of the House Education Committee, which has a provision that bans essentially if research does not directly benefit the child who the research is being performed on, you can't do it. You also have the much more exotic flavor of federal law from Senator Vitter, which, let me grab, I have a lot of this laid out in the handouts that you received, but it required parents to opt in to all research, period. It requires automatic deletion of student records as soon as a student leaves an institution. It eliminated the necessary sharing of PII in certain circumstances, restricted dramatically the use of administrative data, and limited research on non-academic factors that influence learning by prohibiting federal funding for research involving, quote, any type of psychological data. There is a very serious problem with transparency and trust. People are scared. It's really unfortunate that people are really scared. And we have seen just a crazy sweep of laws over the country when it comes to student privacy over the past couple years. To give the full number, 36 states have passed 85 new, brand new, and I'm talking, somewhere between 3 and 40-page laws, 85 new ones since 2013. And as I mentioned, many of the state laws are mostly governance focused. They say you have to have some sort of research governance structure, but some of them are much more damaging. So when you look at Kansas, for example, they passed a 2014 law that requires that you get parental permission for any study or that the data be aggregated before researchers may have access to it. As you can imagine, the SEAs and LEAs do not have time to aggregate the data in a way that is useful to researchers. So the vast majority of research in Kansas has been entirely cut off. You also have laws that have been brought about in part because of research concerns. So I was told there was a new, very strict law that passed in Colorado, had a lot of good governance provisions, but one of the reasons that they passed this very strict law was because of a study from the University of Virginia that was distributed to students that parents could opt out of, but that 3 parents were so outraged about that they lobbied legislators until they passed this law. The law?
Study.
I don't know what the study was. But I know we were just talking about social emotional data, and while social emotional data has a lot of potential, and a lot of policymakers, state boards of education tend to pass the standards in states, and under ESSA they are selecting what the non-cognitive factor must be in school report cards, and I'm happy to talk to anyone after this about if you don't know what I'm talking about. But essentially it means more states are going to be passing social emotional standards, and they're going to have to be measured. So things, as was mentioned, leadership, collaboration, and there is a very strong contingent of people who are terrified of the collection of social emotional data, period. Even if just the teacher sees it, they think it is not the responsibility of the school system. And honestly, I think all of those people would be even more terrified with the presentation we just saw and the fact that researchers would have any access to any of that VR or GoPro data. So this is really, these are hot button issues that scare people, and there's still a law in the books, an executive order from Georgia that was passed in 2013 that bans all collection of psychometric data, period. Not that they're enforcing it, not that it was defined, but they banned the collection of psychometric data, which essentially, my research friends tells me, is any measurement of learning. So this is definitely, as much as we've talked about these concerns, is often mythical or not necessarily lining up with the good practices that researchers have. This is a huge problem, and it's only expanding, especially as we begin to have more studies on social emotional data and figure out the best ways to collect it. It is very likely that more laws will be passed restricting what researchers can do and what they can have access to. So I've talked a little bit about what's driving these laws, and I included in the handout 3 questions or statements that researchers should be prepared to answer because they're the most common ones that I've heard about from pretty much everyone. So the first one is, what is education research and why should I care about it? So there's a great story somebody told me about someone on a Senate or House committee in Congress who wanted to know why they should keep the National Weather Service's weather monitoring station when we have weather.com. For those of you who don't know, weather.com is run using that data. It's very important. I was on a call last year with a bunch of researchers, and we were talking about this, and they were like, of course, policymakers know the value of research. Please don't assume that, because you're already behind if you're assuming that as you're trying to make an argument for why they shouldn't pass one of these laws or why they need to pass better laws that protect privacy while also allowing the research that needs to be done. You have to explain why things are valuable. You have to be transparent. And it's incredibly important because there's a very prevalent belief by parents and policymakers that research is just some doctoral candidate doing scholarship of no relevance to children. And I have been in numerous meetings with congressional staff members who are working for very powerful people who have said there is no reason that research should ever be done unless it's going to benefit that particular child. Parents should be able to opt out or opt in. Which leads to the third point. I'll skip the second one for the moment. You have to be able to respond to, parents should always be allowed to opt their child out of research that will not directly improve their child's education or help their child in some way. Why will opt-outs hinder or not hinder your work? If there's an ability to opt out without hindering the work, encourage it. You want to be able to give power to parents, to others. But if it's a study where significant numbers of opt-outs or even a few opt-outs could entirely skew the study, be prepared to explain why, because people have trouble understanding exactly how that works since it involves certainly statistical things that I have no idea how to explain. And I've included a couple of resources that discuss sort of in very simple ways how you can explain that. And then finally, there's this fear that researchers are able to get access to data and use it for whatever they want. The general public doesn't know what IRBs are, and they assume they're probably in the pocket of the researchers anyways. They don't know that they're these independent bodies. They don't know the high level that you need to go to, and this isn't helped when things like what Bill described is still okay by the IRB standards. So making sure that you're good with privacy beyond the IRB, and that you're able to explain what the protections are that you have in place as you do this research, as well as its value is absolutely key. And so with there, I will leave it because I'm sure we will get to a lot of the questions, but I'm basically here to ring the alarm bell and say there are a lot of people with Orwellian hats on. Don't underestimate them, and don't underestimate what they have already been able to do in Congress and in state legislatures around the country.
Are we done with the panel, or you want to talk at all among yourselves? You have time to talk among yourselves.
I mean, one thing too, I mean, in talking about, I think external fears and opt-outs, and kind of I mean, in a lot of ways, there are at least two conversations happening. There's the conversations that are happening inside rooms like this, where the value of research is unquestioned. Like, we're all here because we know and we understand what research can do. There are conversations that are happening outside this room where that understanding just flat out does not exist, and where there is going to be overt hostility to that point. Not just a lack of understanding, but like overt hostility. And there's going to be a subset of people who will never concede that there's actually value in any research, a subset of people who don't want the government to get anything, and who see publicly funded universities as extensions of the government. I mean, and that's the reality I think that Amelia is alluding to. And so, but with that said, there's also, these, to the extent that some of these fears are becoming manifest in law, we actually have an obligation to understand them. And we also have an obligation to not dismiss them wholesale, because these fears haven't come into existence in a vacuum. And to the extent that we can understand them, doesn't mean agree with them, but definitely understand them, we can actually make our message heard more clearly. And there are also things, a few people talked about transparency. I missed the conversation yesterday afternoon. I actually had to step out for another meeting. But it sounds like transparency was one of the things that was discussed yesterday afternoon. Something else that I saw, and this was within the last month, I saw an NSF grantee that is getting, a significant amount of public money to support learning analytics research. And they have a product that's in use in schools now, and they have no privacy policy on their site. So people who, this is like, again, this is an NSF grantee. There's no privacy policy on their site. There's no mention of IRB terms. Like, there is nothing that anybody can actually see to understand how people are using the data that they get. So there are things that we can actually do in this room, like, if you're working with an external, again, there was some talk yesterday about partnerships, and if there's a partnership, what wins? IRB terms or terms of service? How is that clarified? Where is that documented? These are, again, none of this is particularly interesting, but it's all critical, because it's in this lack of clarity that doubts will flourish. So to the extent that we can provide that level of clarity, we can actually make less room for some of the more, there's always going to be fear. Parenting, I don't know how many people are parents in this room, but any parent can say, like, there are moments of just extreme fear out of concern for what's going to happen to our kid. And that, and again, a lack of clarity about what's happening with research and information and how that could potentially affect our kid, that's a potentially toxic conversation. And we can, the fear isn't a toxic conversation, but like, if that is allowed to go unchecked, that can lead to problems. So to the extent that we can provide clarity just by some really simple intentional choices, we can make everybody's lives easier.
I'll jump in quick before we go to audience questions. I know one of the things that I didn't address initially that I know we had brought up as something that was addressed a little bit in Andrew's paper, but also has been talked about a little bit, and I'd love to hear all of you as well, is what is the need for law? Do we need to have an update of FERPA? Do we need to have these new state laws? I mean, they're here to stay, but are they really necessary? And certainly, as I've done my work working with states, yes, these are very good. I mean, as of February, 15 state education agencies still didn't have anything about privacy on their webpage. So laws that encourage having a governance policy and making it available to stakeholders and making sure that people are building this trust are good. It's just a matter of making sure that the laws that are passed don't cause major accidental consequences. So we had a particularly strict law, and I know we talked yesterday about once a law is passed, it's very hard to get it overturned, but thankfully the nice thing about the states doing this before the feds weigh in on changing FERPA is we've had a lot of examples of unintended consequences and fixes for them. So we had Louisiana, who passed the strictest law in the country, which essentially the Department of Ed is not allowed to see any student PII ever, period. That part of the law still stands. The other part was that districts could not share any, period, information unless they got parental opt-in. And this caused all sorts of chaos. Districts weren't sure. Oh, and I should add that the catch-all to all of this is that there were personal fines and jail time if you violated the law personally as a teacher, as a researcher, as a third party, as a principal, whoever. So districts were understandably terrified about potentially violating any section of the law and ended up not announcing names at football games, having yearbooks, and unfortunately not referring some student names to the state scholarship fund, even though they were allowed to have it because those parents did not bring back forms. You had teachers that were making home visits. You had, it was chaos, and thankfully they came back the next year and essentially were like, okay, districts, you can do all of these things, you're fine, just have a privacy policy. But the penalties and the restrictions on the SEA still exist. So again, this is, you want to have good laws, but you want to avoid the unintended consequences, and you do that by taking part in the process in each of your states or in any states that you work with to let them know how you make sure that policymakers are getting the information that you have. So again, about transparency, making what you do valuable to them, and making sure that there aren't these accidental consequences that can occur frequently without any understanding of what those might be. For example, and this sort of peripherally involves research, you had New Hampshire, which passed a law in 2015 where they banned video recordings in classrooms unless there was permission gotten from the school board, from every student in the class, from every parent, and from the teacher themselves. It was unclear the way that the law was written whether this applied to one classroom video recording or to multiple or whatever it may be. And as many of you may know, if you do teacher evaluation work, video recordings are absolutely essential in them receiving certification. In addition, there were also major problems that came up because many special education students had video recordings as part of their individual education plans to help them learn. So the law was partially reversed this year. They got rid of the sections that restricted special ed students. The ban on video recordings when it comes to teacher certification and all that is still in place. So again, it's about making these cases, talking to legislators. When we talk about transparency, it's not just because it's a good idea, it's because it's absolutely necessary to continue the work that all of you are doing. And laws do need to be in place to ensure governance, because when there is a breach, it's not because there's a bad actor in the research community. It is a condemnation from these parents and from everyone else of the entire research community, or the entire vendor community, or the education community as a whole.
All right, I want to open it up to the audience in a minute, but if you have a point to make.
I'm sorry, just a very quick point, which simplifies what you have said, right, in terms of having transparency and building that trust with parents and students. It happened to me. So I was in Brooklyn, and we had nothing, absolutely nothing. No automated system, no dashboard. I couldn't get to my kids' information for a number of reasons. And that was fine. You know, I did what I could because I didn't have the information. I moved to a different state, a new district, a new school district, and all of a sudden I get in an email before the school started, oh, your kids' information is online, you can access their grades, their IEPs, their addresses, and not only that, but also the schools, their classmates' addresses and all this information, which is fantastic. I love having that access. But it was very jarring for me to get that email and say, well, nobody asked me if this was okay. They just took my kids' information and put it into a database, which is part of the school process, which is part of the district process, and they need that information. And I'm perfectly fine with them having that, but it really felt wrong that they just took this information without telling me that they were even going to do it. I didn't need for them to ask permission to use it. I wanted just to know that they were going to do that. And I think that's really key in understanding when you talk about transparency. We are not, as parents, we're not asking you to tell us all the nuances of your research studies or how you're going to go about getting your findings. We don't need that, but we do need to understand that you're going to be doing this and what your ultimate goal is. Just a high level, this is what we're trying to achieve. And I bet you're going to have a lot more parent buy-in, a lot more school buy-in, and a lot more student buy-in if you just communicate. Simple communication is going to go a long way.
All right, before I throw it open, I just want to contextualize a little bit some of the fears we're hearing about education data in the larger context of privacy. The parent that might be worried about the kind of data that we're collecting as researchers in the project that I described, and of course parents do have a lot of protections in that project. If their kid is sitting at home at night playing a massively multiplayer online game with their webcam on and using digital audio to communicate with their teammates and simultaneously having up a window with a web forum, guess what? We know everything about what's happening with that kid, we meaning the gaming company, and there's no IRB and there's no protections of any kind. I was at Siegl, the computer science and AI lab at MIT the other day. They were describing a research project where somebody has figured out correctly that any wireless router actually is a radar field. And with just a little bit of work, you can chart at a very high degree of resolution the movements and even the pulse of every person in the house where there's a wireless router. We are facing a degree of collection of data about us totally outside of education and totally outside of any protections whatsoever that's staggering. And if people want to worry, I think understanding that context and trying to get everyone in the world concerned enough to have a rational policy about all the different levels of data use is better than sort of saying, well, let's just look at education and not worry about the rest of it, because a lot of people who may not be worried about education, who may not care that some parents with extreme views pass an extreme law, might get much more interested if they really understood what was happening just from carrying a cell phone around with you that has apps on it.
And Chris, I would agree that context is helpful, but I think the other part of that context is that playing World of Warcraft isn't compulsory public education. Attendance is.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, and also, the reason why that analogy breaks down is just because it's awful over here doesn't mean it's okay for it to be bad over here.
Right.
And an awareness of privacy across the board is essential, but separating out, again, I mean, just because things are not okay in the consumer space doesn't give us license to be less than stellar in the education space. I think we should aspire to be fantastic and have that be a model for other.
No, and I wasn't meaning to imply that. I'm sorry if it came across that way, but what I was meaning to say is everybody should be worried about privacy on dimensions that they don't even realize exist. And if everyone is worried about privacy, then a larger group of people with perhaps a larger proportion of rational people involved can be working together to make a good set of decisions that include compulsory situations.
I will say in my experience, though, it tends to be a curse on all your heads. So the more parents know about privacy violations in general in the consumer movement, the more they're freaked out about them in education world.
Yeah,
It's not a rational thing. It's very much so it's a my child, my information, their information. I don't want their opportunities limited in the future, and I can't opt out of that. And that enclosed box that people are put in because we need the information in order to educate their child and in order to help them learn is the framework that we're dealing with.
I would also really urge us all to avoid words like rational or irrational. I think everybody is a rational actor. Just because we don't understand what's driving them at a specific point, we should not use that to undermine their agency or their rationality. I think there might be a couple people who have questions.
Yeah, we should throw it open to questions.
And Eric's been waiting for a long time.
So I have one comment and one quick question. The comment was that the word transparency is being used. Rick Hanashek. The word transparency seems to be used in many different ways here, and some of which I don't understand. Part of it is how do researchers explain what they're doing, and there are regular protocols that researchers go through to explain all the details, and those are available in excruciating detail that most researchers don't want to read. Right? But to the extent that it's understanding what the results are of studies and so forth, every researcher in this room and in probably the United States feels that more people should read their work and know about their work. And it's a matter of how do you have an effective dissemination program. And if you had an effective dissemination program, then how would you introduce some quality control into that dissemination program, because there are differences of opinion, particularly in educational research. So I don't think it's all just getting the word out to every parent. I mean, I study all the fourth graders in the state of Texas, and at some point I have results on all the learning of all the fourth graders in the state of Texas. What do I do with it? Well, I try to get it to most every researcher and to lots of policymakers, but it's not something that you readily get out. And that's not transparency to me. That's the dissemination of reasonable research and how that has implications. The quick question is, Bill, I was waiting for the next sentence in your story about, so this means we should, you know, I mean, it's this elaborate story and I didn't know where it went.
So I'll talk a little bit about what transparency means, because I've been working with a lot of SEAs and districts on this. Transparency means saying what data you're collecting, what is the purpose, and how you are protecting it. For your research, the state of Texas, having the SEA posted if you get it from there, having the districts posted if you get it from there. And oftentimes when we don't have transparency up front, you end up with laws like Colorado's, which just passed this year, which requires the entire MOU, contracts, et cetera, with researchers to be posted on websites of districts in the SEA. And believe me, once people start parsing that, they're going to opt out. So it's making sure, first of all, that you answer those questions. What data are you collecting? Why do you need it? How are you protecting it? And maybe in there, if you haven't gotten to that with why are you doing it, what is your overall goal? How will this help, maybe not this child, but your grandchildren or kids like your child? People do have empathy here, and using that is very valuable. And then once your research is done, or once you have a past example of research, you can say, check out this 5 sentences where I summarize in easy to understand language. Remember, the average person in the US has the reading level of an 8th grader. You need to make sure it is readable and understandable by an 8th grader. And have that become almost your abstract. Here's what it is. Here's the little piece. And then it goes, this is a local thing. You're not working with all the parents in the US, you're working with a particular district or a particular state. And that's where the transparency goes to. And that's where you can pull on those partnerships that we were discussing with districts or with states to really show that. Many of you in this room work for institutions and you have websites. If the district or the state doesn't post information, post it on your website so the parent who's curious about your study gets it when they run the Google search. Make sure that it's somewhere.
I do it and people don't read it.
That's fine. The thing is making sure it is there and that it is at that 8th grade level where people can actually understand it.
And I would emphasize that this is something that has to be done in conjunction with the school, because that's where the primary connection is. I liken this to what is a very nascent practice where we're being more transparent about the commercial applications that we're using and describing how they're being used and providing links to more information.
And just to answer really quick, when you say, I posted but nobody reads it, then at least when a parent has a concern or a school has a concern, then at least you already have that there and you can point it to them and say, hey, it's already posted there. If you're interested, go see it, and not have that be a reaction to somebody's concern. You're already being preemptive and saying it's there and pointing them to them instead of, let me put something up for you to read.
And so also, quick thing to answer your question, what was next in the story? There are a few technical things that happen there. First is if you're building an app, like use encryption, don't send sensitive information in the URLs. We're not going to get into the technical weed. The short answer is, if your research involves building an app, get a security audit. Security audits are something that should be happening, period.
Or a website.
What's this?
Or a website.
Yeah. And security audits, they are our friends. All of us in the industry make mistakes. Every single application that's out there has bugs. Every single application that's out there has security issues. Whenever I hear somebody say, we've never had a breach, I cringe, because what they should really be saying is, we've never had a breach that we know of. And so, the short answer is, they should have had a security audit on that app.
But it's not that app that's important, right? You found that app and so forth.
Yes.
It's how do you set up an institutional structure or regulatory structure or whatever that would, in fact, get to the answers that you just told me? I've never written an app, and I'm not going to.
Well, and so the short answer, we actually, as part of my work at Common Sense, we actually wrote a basic information security primer. When I say basic, I mean basic. But if the ed tech industry and people in academia, if they actually just ran through these basic testing steps, and I mean basic testing steps, all of the articles that appeared as news in the Washington Post and the Times would never have been written, because they all exploited things that are really easily discoverable and really easily fixed.
I will add to that, and thank you Bill, because you sort of stirred this thought. A great way to figure out what questions you need to be asking if you're like me and you're totally separated from the security side of these things is there are a lot of great resources that are aimed at the vendors, and I know you don't think about yourselves as being part of that, but a lot of what they do in terms of putting together contracts and working with districts and taking care of personal information is very similar in structure to what all of you do with your contracts and getting the information and being careful and having security. So you can use the resources that are out there. Keith Kruger from COSIN, they've put out an amazing toolkit for both districts and vendors. And they have, for example, the 10 questions you need to ask about security that you can then take to your university and say, are we doing these things? So there's a ton of resources across the board, more than I can possibly name in the time allotted. Email me, contact me. I will refer you to all of the resources that you want on any of this, and any of us on this panel, I think, could. So please, there are now, we've been in this long enough that we have some of the resources that can help you answer these questions.
I have a question that's sort of a follow-up to one of Chris's comments for both Olga and Amelia. I see two trains coming at each other. On one hand, 21st century digital literacy training materials usually teach teachers to use tools like Prezi, Hangouts, Google Docs. All of these are kept by corporations. You type into Google Docs, there's a complete clickstream log of what your student did in that tool that Google owns under a privacy policy that, unless you're using Google Apps for Education, is not compliant with FERPA. Most of the tools from startups like Prezi, I don't know about Prezi, but most similar tools are not compliant with FERPA. Teachers assign these pretty much willy-nilly. They share, recommend. That's happening, and that needs to happen for students to learn to use such tools. At the other hand, you have relatively draconian privacy laws coming in that are saying this can't happen. Google is collecting data on my students, 100 little startups, any of which may go out of business and be sold to the highest bidder, are collecting data on my students. How do you reconcile these two realities?
So first of all, what the teachers are doing, even before any of these state laws passed, generally will violate FERPA. Teachers under FERPA are able to sign contracts on behalf of the schools as school officials under FERPA, which means when they click yes to the terms of service, they are signing a contract on behalf of the school, and under FERPA, the school has to keep direct control over that information, and obviously they are not able to do that. It varies depending on circumstance, like your Google Docs example. It wouldn't violate FERPA if it's just the student using maybe their Apps for Education account and it's not something the teacher grades because that's not part of the student record. So there's all sorts of legal nuances, which is one of the many reasons why people want FERPA rewritten to be much clearer. But there's a problem. So, I mean, I don't think that they are that separate because it's an issue. And I will say there are many, many districts and many, many states that are now saying, teachers, you are not allowed to download things or assign an app or use this unless you run it through our IT department or go off a pre-approved list or whatever it may be. So we're actually having some cutbacks in what could be some great ed tech tools because we had sort of this free-for-all over here where teachers were very well-intentioned. Again, this is a theme. Well-intentions are not enough here because people still are like, well, this is happening and oh my God, and paints everybody with a really wide brush, but it's a problem, and that's a lot of that has contributed to the state laws over here.
I'd really like to come back to that, just because there's a lot of in this conversation where folks are talking for districts and educators, and this is actually my day job. I spend most of my time testing the security and privacy of these apps. Just a slight difference of opinion on a statement that FERPA allows teachers to accept contracts. I would say that the Department of Ed would certainly think that a click-through terms of service is a contract. I will tell you that I cannot sign a contract in my district. No teacher can sign a contract in my district. So I would say that teachers in general don't have the ability to sign up unless it's been something that's been clear. We don't have the ability to sign contracts. So just I think we're on the same page on that.
Yeah, it should have clarified under FERPA. They are allowed to, if there is a policy saying otherwise, or it's generally understood under the district's law, school's law, state law, then they're not able to. So it really depends on whether the state, district, or school has defined who is able to sign that contract.
And have you defined that, Jim?
I'm sorry.
And have you or your state defined that?
Defined.
Or you defined that a teacher cannot, under FERPA, it might be allowed, they might be considered officials, but under state law, your state law, they can, or is that just your policy?
So it is our policy, but my read on FERPA is there's something very specific in the school official exception under FERPA where schools are required in their annual notice to define how they define a school official, and that can be the definition, or what I would say to be a more transparent and proactive way to be explicitly listing the school service providers. And I would say that Google Apps for Education would be an acceptable example, and Prezi makes a product that is named for education. Whether or not that means that it's compliant with FERPA is certainly an open question. And a good practice in districts are when you are using a product that was designed for consumers, certainly COPPA, that other law certainly can kick in, but having a separate data sharing agreement with that vendor, and that's considered a best practice. An organization like COSIN has a set of good privacy practices, and one of the major areas is, does a school district have a set of business processes for evaluating and communicating and including in professional development that kind of practice?
Okay, we have 4 mics on, so people need to know.
Sorry. And it's, Google Apps for Education is a little bit different than just going into a Google Docs like we're all here today, right? So my oldest kid, they use Google in his school, and what the school did that was really smart was they sent out a notice to the entire school, and they said, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, every kid's gonna get a Google email, but it's a Google email that they have to log in when they're in school. They cannot use this outside of school because it's just not gonna work. It has to be within the network of the school. So when we talk about Google Apps for Education, it's limited use within the school. I don't know if every school has that restriction, but our school does. So what was fantastic about it was just the communication. The principal on the first day of whatever meeting he had, he got up and said, this is what we're doing for the school year, and by the way, we're working with Google to have this in the school. This is how it's going to work. Look out for more information as we distribute it. So I'm very happy that my kid can use that and is learning how to use email and how to go into his Google Docs. And he doesn't have to remember to bring a piece of paper into school because it's in the school, so he forgets his homework. He can print it out in the library, or he can email it to the teacher within that closed network. So that's important.
Yes.
David Figlio, Northwestern University. I want to thank all of you on the panel for a provocative and thoughtful conversation. I actually also want to second something that Bill said, which is I think that in many different dimensions of our society right now, not just this one, I think very frequently people kind of revert to negative adjectives to describe other people. There's clearly an awful lot of truth on a lot of different sides, and I think it's important for all of us to make sure that we try our hardest not to demean people who have a different opinion about these types of things. I feel very, very strongly that student research should be certain elements of student data should be made available for research purposes And a subset of that should be made available without an opt-out possibility. I'll get to that in just 30 seconds. But first, I think it's actually useful to give a little bit of biography. So I'm a parent of 3 children myself, 2 of whom have IEPs. One has an extraordinary, significant IEP that is potentially, for somebody who really wanted to identify her, somebody could probably drill in and find her with things. All of my children have, as of a month ago, graduated from high school, so it is none of them now. If I want researchers to use my children's data for research, and none of them are going to benefit my children directly in their K-12 education. I think that's useful because it's relevant for parents' rights activists to understand too that that of course most researchers are parents themselves and are understanding these types of things, and we don't want our kids' data abused either. One thing that I would love to see a discussion about is so often people just move to these polls. I'd love to see a discussion of a relatively finite subset of administratively collected data that hopefully pretty much everybody could figure out a way to agree on. I see very little argument against a situation in which there was a subset of administratively collected data that could be fully de-identified, that could be used for research purposes with relatively few constraints associated, and could, under certain circumstances, be merged in a manner with data sets that are also sufficiently broad that they would be not individually identifiable, that could be used for research. And so a great example of this is every one of us who has had a child in the United States born after 1968 has our children's data publicly available and their vital statistics publicly available, but not in a way that you could go and identify a very specific individual. I could very easily see a situation in which states were to make available something of that matter. I think 80% of the research done using administratively collected data could be, a data set like that could actually be satisfactory. Another 10% could be done if there was a mechanism, which we can currently do with the vital statistics data, in which you send a data set with here's X and Y, and out comes a merged data set that also is not individually identifiable. Other people want to talk too, but I guess my question is, I'd like to ask the panelists, suppose we were, this wouldn't deal with a lot of what's swirling around in the room and in the discussion about this, but do members of the panel see an issue potentially with designing data systems that are completely uncrackable in this manner, much like the vital statistics data? I know you're smiling, I did that intentionally. Very, 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 very difficult to identify any specific individual that could satisfy a large, an overwhelming majority of research needs. I wouldn't want that to be the only type of data that could be used for research purposes, but even if we could just talk about that. Anyway, thank you.
I would be surprised if the 2 people that would self-identify as technologists would be comfortable with saying something is uncrackable. Even in good weather, I'd be afraid lightning would strike me. So that's obviously not a question that can be answered in the space of the panel, but it does touch on one thing that I had stubbed out as a talking point. I think with regard to security and some of the issues that Bill brought up. I mean, there is this concept of reasonable security, which is an evolving concept. I think what we don't have is we don't have an active conversation around reasonable privacy. And I think that's a conversation that's worth happening. I think when we talk about comparing it to FERPA, basically reasonable privacy within de-identification, and I think it's worth describing what do you mean by good de-identification. De-identification, in the 70s was not recognizable by someone with knowledge in the school community. I think, with big data and the internet and the potential of distribution of data sets, we've significantly redefined what a person in the school community is. So I think those are things that need to be in consideration for a conversation around reasonable privacy.
I'm Ilana Zaidi. I'm a legal scholar affiliated with NYU and Princeton. So I just wanted to comment on that, following up in the sense that we are talking a lot about, this is about security in some ways and what is protected. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of these concerns are not so much about the idea of protection as ethics and decision making and who has control over what happens to students. Especially if the information is being fed back for use. So I just wanted to point that out in the sense that even if you take care of the technological issues, I think a lot of it is simply about a desire to be able to control. That is, you may be able to reassure people slightly about that, but it's also fundamental.
Yes.
This is Kirsten Martin. I'm at GW here in the school business. And just to follow up, I would agree. I mean, there are issues around security, and IRBs are getting better and better at asking questions about secondary data sets and questions about security. And they've got a long way to go, but computer scientists deal with this as well, just in general, not just about student data. But they're getting used to having to go to an IRB where they previously never had to go to an IRB. But a lot of the issues that come up in the Colorado, I quickly looked this up, are around the voluntarily giving away of student data to Pearson, right? I mean, that was the issue around Colorado, and we should call a spade a spade. I mean, that's a totally different animal than, and to call them a researcher is lumping researchers in with commercial interests that are trying to use this data for their own marketing purposes, or if Google collects my student's data, my child's data when he logs in on his personal account, which all students do, they're doing that for a different reason. And so I think it's important to realize there is a difference between security issues, leaving a disk around, or allowing something to be open with it should be encrypted. Those are things that we can continually see as threats from an outsider. I think some of the issues that school districts are facing are self-inflicted because they are voluntarily giving away, selling student data. And then, unfortunately, researchers are being lumped in with that. And the Colorado example is a great example because to point to the Colorado University study that was around sex and drugs, and some people in Colorado Springs got upset about that, that's not surprising. There's areas in my county, Montgomery County, that would be upset by that. I mean, so that Colorado Springs is a special place, right? I mean, and so they get upset about those types of things. And so, but that's, to blame it on that, it's Pearson, right? I mean, this was Pearson and the contracts, they couldn't explain them and all that kind of stuff. So I would just say that some of this is a privacy issue about inappropriate flows of information that the school districts are getting into. And that might be different than security, which is also important, but the issues could be disentangled a little bit.
It's very difficult to kind of lay this at the feet of one specific vendor. And also, if you actually read through the terms of service and privacy policies of many commercial apps, a large number of them actually include and actually explicitly claim the right to share data or reuse data for research purposes. So I think, a lot of vendors are actually claiming the mantle of researchers and are claiming the ability to do that. We also, I think, muddy those waters ourselves when there are public-private partnerships that use data collected from vendors for research. I think, we're seeing this increasingly. I also, just to clarify, few to no districts are actually selling student data. Like, that is not something, there might be isolated case of that, but that is not a widespread practice that I have seen in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes through the terms of service, they can unintentionally cede control over data when they shouldn't, but that's, I think, both technically and legally a different thing than a sale. And in terms of, for reasons of time, I'll break it up here.
To talk about Colorado.
About the selling, I understand that they're not going to say that they sell the data, just like putting web trackers on a website. People don't admit that they sell the data, but they get discounted Chromebooks, they get discounted services, discounted apps, with the understanding that then they're able to give the discount because they get to use the student data for their own purposes. And
That's
so,
incorrect.
Yeah.
But no, that's definitely, first of all, it's illegal. In every single state under FERPA, you are not allowed to do that, period. There is nobody that I have met in the time that I have done this, and I think all of us can say on this panel that has ever happened. And in fact, a lot of times you find better privacy practices at Google Education, at Pearson, because they're the ones in the spotlight, and they've been very conscious of that. Oftentimes, the biggest challenges that occur when it comes to vendors are with small mom and pop started up in a garage places, which are often former teachers or researchers that are like, I found this thing that works, and that's awesome, and they create an app and they accidentally have a security vulnerability. That's the primary thing, and we also need to remember that about 96% of breaches occur because of human error. This is not about third parties. That's where a lot of the fears are. So a lot of laws address that. But a lot of times it's the basic security, it's the basic privacy, knowing how to explain these things. When it comes to Colorado, I actually didn't hear anything. I was working pretty closely with the department on this law. I didn't hear anything about Pearson, period, being behind this law. And it's interesting to note that there was an earlier version of this law. This is an amended law that was passed in 2014. The prior law was much more governance focused. And if you look at the thrust of what was added in this law, it is aimed primarily at researchers with some third-party bits, but primarily, I think it ended up being like 4 pages of this handout. These were very research focused. So this was not something, certainly third-party concerns are part of this, and Colorado is a case study all on its own because it was instrumental in a lot of the In Bloom stuff. It's gone through a lot of issues, and they were really forward-facing when it came to addressing privacy and security vulnerabilities, and they have a particular political climate which has lent itself to a lot of this, but Colorado was not nearly as much about the third parties. It was about the fears of researchers.
Well, and then, so maybe I was looking at the 2016 law.
We do have to stop at this point and continue the discussion in the next panel during break. Well, all right.
Okay. Great. So in thinking of closing, I just want to add some encouragement. So much of the conversation has been focused on harm as defined narrowly as breach, and I would ask you to consider expanding your definition of that. There's lots of kinds of potential harm, the effects of surveillance in a school, and I know Alana's written about this. One of the biggest concerns is how data will be used. We saw this with assessments and concerns with teachers about how that would be used in teacher evaluation. I think so much of this is really kind of focused on the very specific examples of surveys. And I think one example, certainly for those of us local, Mount St. Mary's, the example of the survey, which was very clearly intended to be used to get rid of students.
If you don't know about this, find out about it, because
the link is in my notes. But I think it's one example. It's more than just harm. It's about surveillance effects. It's about concerns about how data will be used. There's lots of different examples of harm.
Just one clarifying question. Are you saying that as far as researchers are concerned, there's no difference in access and governance between data that a school or district would collect itself and the data that is collected on behalf of the school or district by a commercial vendor.
Do you define difference?
Well, I'm saying researcher access, you know, the kinds of IRB and other kinds of reviews, freedom of sharing. If you have an agreement with the district, is that an agreement with the vendor? Those kinds of questions. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, so I can have you answer that. So essentially, when a school provides a vendor with data, one of the ways they are allowed to provide the vendor with data is essentially by designating the vendor as a school official, which means they are under the direct control of the school with respect to the data, which means there are strict limits on their ability to redisclose the data. So the short answer to the question is there's no difference. Any other differences need to be worked out contractually between the vendor and the school before the researcher kind of enters and makes the request for the data.
Well, except there are some vendors who will actively limit their ability to reuse and specifically to recontextualize that data. So there are some vendors who have actually gone out of their way to place explicit limits on themselves in the form of data sunsets, where they'll delete data after a certain time.
Yeah.
They will also contractually limit what their third parties can do with it.
Well, that's a standard part of the business requirements from a privacy and security perspective on the vendor. So it goes beyond, so there are limits in terms of what the school allows them to do. And then it goes beyond that. Vendors have other obligations, and there are a myriad of state laws that, as we've discussed, that put other obligations on the vendor. So data retention policies, third-party limitations, but all of that is designed to serve the school client in the end.
And, you know, most schools, I would say, are using vendors to collect this information. So when we talk about schools collecting information, is not somebody that's hired at the school to go in and do the data entry for it. There's no bandwidth for it. So when you talk about what vendors are collecting and what a school collects, it's really one and the same, depending on what kind of service that they're contracting to.
And there are very good reasons for that. The privacy, the security levels that a lot of vendors can offer. One, I thought, really interesting comment from a chief information officer at a prominent higher ed institution at a recent conference we had was that he had initially been against the use of Google Apps because of a lot of the very valid privacy concerns, particularly regarding their general products. And he found, when he was evaluating them and talking to them, the level of security was so far above. Just think of the patches on your computer. Behind each of those patches is probably tens of thousands of people who figured out, okay, there's a security vulnerability, what do we need to do to fix it, what is the code, et cetera, et cetera. And if you allocate that responsibility to a school on its own, the security is frequently not sufficient to protect the information. So there are a lot of really good reasons, and happy to chat more about this, about why schools have brought vendors into this process. So it's a matter of, again, just balancing, making sure there's privacy while also allowing the positive effects of the information to go forward.
So Susan and David, what is your judgment about where are we?
Well, this is a really important topic. I am concerned about that we get to the panel on, you know, looking across the conference and talking about where we go from here, which is the one that Susan is leading very soon. We didn't put any time for a break in this morning's session, and given the urgency of both the issues that are raised here as well as what's coming in the next panel, I would like to suggest that we move to the next panel. And remember that we do have a half hour at the end of the day where Susan and I will be leading a discussion, and we can certainly return to these pressing issues you know, in that time frame there too. Is that okay with you, Susan? Okay, I'm declaring a 10-minute mental and other sorts of health break, and then we'll reconvene at at 10:40, okay? And then we'll compress the other panel a little bit. And let's thank this panel for raising a really, really important set of issues for all of us.